BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. Welcome to the home of True Crime Talk Radio and your premier destination for unsolved mysteries, criminal psychology, and exploring the dark side of cyberspace. My name is Ned DeHaan, and let the show begin. Okay, hello everybody. Today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? Just a couple of quick announcements and reminders before we truly begin. The first is that Thursdays are now dedicated to live streams here on Black Box Online Radio. I did the first one last week, and I will be doing another one tomorrow to anyone who is listening to these as they come out live. And if you're listening in the future, feel free to tune in to some of the live stream on-camera episodes of Black Box Online Radio. And if you are again listening to this live, and you have some questions about Jack the Ripper that you would like an immediate response to, feel free to tune in to tomorrow's live stream, which should start at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and you can always put stuff in the comments section later on if you're in a different time zone. Now, I also wanted to make the announcement that I am the author of the book Killer on a White Horse, A Story of the Evening Watchman, and I've been releasing the audio book on YouTube for free, and those episodes will come out on the weekends. Some chapters will come out on Saturdays and Sundays, so please look out for that as well here on Black Box Online Radio, and also giving a big thank you to everyone who listened to the YouTube Shorts episodes that have come out here on BBOR, and those are also released on Instagram, BlackBoxNed88 over on Instagram, and on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box under the name Ned DeHaan, and those are still going to be coming out regularly. And a great way to support all of these efforts is to go through some of the links in the description box, and one of them is for BuyMeACoffee.com. BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNed88 allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout-out on Zodiac Monday. And I do need to reinforce a point that true crime content on YouTube gets demonetized all the time. So if you have any interest in helping a channel like this, please feel free to visit BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNed88. There's a link to that in the description box. Now, I had a bunch of things to discuss with you guys for Ripper Wednesday, but I just happened to notice a video, thanks to the YouTube algorithm, that was put out by the House of Lechmere channel that came out 2 weeks ago, and based on the name, of course, it is going to be talking about Charles Lechmere as a Jack the Ripper suspect, and the House of Lechmere channel is presented by Edward Stowe, and he gave the presentation again, and he was responding to a specific documentary that had been made by the BBC, which was called Jack the Ripper, The Case Reopened. And overall, I think he did a very good job with the presentation. He showed how it's a mainstream media production, and there are certain inaccuracies in their presentation, looking at small segments of this documentary, The Case Reopened, and then looking at segments of the police reports and showing how and why they made certain errors. But the biggest point that I had to disagree with him on was, it's not even an exact disagreement because he was the one providing the information. Of course, the channel's called House of Lechmere. Their suspect is Charles Allen Lechmere, someone who could have had very intense familiarity with the area. It was on his walking path to work. He also grew up in other parts of the city that would have given him some strong familiarity with the case. And I've talked a lot about him in 2 episodes that I've done about Charles Lechmere here on this channel for Ripper Wednesday, and one of them was actually a Friday episode. But one point at the beginning of this presentation made by Edward Stowe was that the first victim murdered by Jack the Ripper officially was Polly Nichols, and by the time that Charles Lechmere, he's the first person to find her body, and the second person to find her body, Robert Pohl, approached her, she was freshly dead, just barely dead. She hadn't been dead for long, and then it couldn't have been more than a minute or a matter of minutes. I think that the exact term that was used in Edward Stowe's presentation was a matter of minutes. And he provided an explanation that if her body had been so freshly dead and she had just recently stopped breathing, that would either mean that Charles Lechmere committed the murder, or, and this is a big or, another suspect was able to commit the murder and escape without being seen. And I'm just thinking, excuse me, you've just provided an excellent explanation about how it could have been a different suspect. I mean, that's the whole thing. That's the whole reason why it's an unsolved case. Somebody else committed the murder, and they were able to leave without being seen. And that's how the Ripper got away with the crime, as well as the other crimes, although there are indeed witness sightings of the Ripper and other possible witness sightings of the Ripper in some of the other murders. Jack the Ripper was a serial killer who operated in London in 1888, and whatever happened before or after that is still part of the mystery. Now, that is just something that I wanted to share very briefly. I've talked a lot about Charles Lechmere in previous episodes, so today I would like to talk about a Jack the Ripper suspect whom I've never mentioned before on the channel, and his name is William Bury. You'll probably find his name written under William Henry Bury. And he is someone who is going to follow a very similar true crime pattern that we've seen from a lot of other Jack the Ripper suspects. And he goes on to become a convicted murderer, murdering his wife, Ellen Bury, actually. She, of course, took his last name. And there's actually a website simply called WilliamBury.org that completely outlines a case for him. And what I thought was really interesting about this website, WilliamBury.org, is that it's not composed by someone who is selling a book on the subject, but rather challenging the ideas that are in other books, the way that I more or less do here on BlackBoxOnlineRadio. So I definitely appreciated the open-minded, fair shake on the subject point of view. But some background on William Bury is that he grew up in a very rough state of childhood. His father was more or less a deadbeat, and his mother went into an asylum. When he was still a child, he had two siblings, a brother and a sister, and they were more or less left to fend for themselves. And it's possible that this could have been some type of traumatizing event, a traumatic event in his childhood. And I'm sure that it was. Absolutely, I'm sure that it was. And he's more or less in poverty for the remainder of his youth, but then it seems that he's able to convince someone to marry him, Ellen Bury, and he goes in and out of dealing with money because her family had more money than him, and he was one of the things that was put forward on a channel called Coffee, Crime, and Mayhem was a specific reason why William Bury wanted to marry his wife was because she had more money than him. But another big problem with William Bury is that he was, for all intents and purposes, an alcoholic. He drank very heavily, and on WilliamBury.org it stated very clearly that he was only sober on Sundays. Sunday was the only day of the week that he did not drink, and they stated very clearly that that is a piece of evidence in favor of him being Jack the Ripper, because a lot of serial killers tend to operate under the influence of alcohol or another substance. And I also had to take a step back and be like, wait a second. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. I am completely 50-50 on that point. I'm completely down the middle. Some serial killers do indeed get high or drunk before they're committing their crimes, and other people are stone cold sober, and they want to be sober because they want to have full awareness of their senses while they're committing the murders. So I can't really give that one a complete seal of approval or form of agreement. But some other things happened with William Bury that he would have gotten out of the Whitechapel area, and gotten out of London, I should say, to be more precise, and he moves to Scotland, to Dundee, with his wife, and that's where the murder takes place. He murders his wife in somewhat of a similar way to compare it to that of Jack the Ripper. She is strangled, and her body is mutilated, and then he hides her in a box. And even in one description that I read online, it must have been on the William Bury website, her legs were broken and then placed into the box. And I thought that that was a rather, odd detail. I mean, not in terms of someone trying to conceal evidence in a murder, but that's completely different than that of Jack the Ripper. And I'm going to be honest with you guys. When I was first reading about William Henry Bury as a Jack the Ripper suspect, I was very skeptical. I'm like, all right, he committed another murder. That doesn't mean that he was the Whitechapel fiend, now does it? I mean, in fact, his story is very similar to that of Karl Feigenbaum, the German sailor who went to the United States of America and committed a murder there. And I think that a big difference between that case and the case of William Henry Bury is that there are indeed Jack the Ripper similarities. Number one, her her body, I mean, the body of the victim was strangled. Number two, her body was mutilated. But the key difference is that her throat was not slashed. This is something that Jack the Ripper did. Even with the third murder, the murder of Long Liz Stride, Jack the Ripper slashed her throat, and that was the only way that he was able to murder her. And the explanation that has been provided in the theory involving William Henry Bury is just that he did it on familiar territory where he knew that he wouldn't be interrupted, so it wasn't necessary to slash her throat. I mean, it's not even in a place like Miller's Court with the murder of Mary Kelly, where it's not on the Ripper's turf. That would be Mary Kelly's turf. He was in the comfort of his own home. I wish I hadn't said that comfort in terms of committing a murder, but that is indeed what most likely happened. But here is something that I don't quite understand completely in this theory involving William Henry Bury. People are hypothesizing that he committed the murder of his wife because she knew that he was Jack the Ripper, and he didn't want her to go public with that. But I think there's a very big contradictory piece of evidence, and that is that William Henry Bury confesses ultimately to committing the murder of his wife, but adamantly denies that he was Jack the Ripper, and Bury is sentenced to hang at the gallows. Now, if he already knows that he's going to die, then why hide that? Why hide that? Why would he choose to hold back that information? Did he just not want to create a panic or something? Was it supposed to be a deep, dark secret? I don't know. Was he comfortable talking about the murder of his wife because he was already vilified for that and everybody knew it? But did he want to hold on to this dark secret that he was Jack the Ripper? I'm uncertain. But if he knew that he was going to pass away, then why not just reveal it if he had already confessed to another murderer? Everybody already thinks that he's a murderer. I mean, I don't comprehend that aspect of the theory involving William Henry Bury, and if anything, I think that lowers his likelihood of being Jack the Ripper. Now, some of you guys know that I used to listen to the program Murder After Midnight, hosted by Ripperologist Martin Fido. Martin Fido had the suspect David Cohen, who was also known as Nathan Kaminsky. And when I was listening to Murder After Midnight last spring, I had just done the episode on Thomas Neal Cream, who was a real serial killer called the Lambeth Poisoner, and I was paying very close attention when Martin Fido started talking about Thomas Cream as a Jack the Ripper suspect. And he said that there's this famous story that Thomas Cream was also executed in the gallows for, again, being a serial killer, and his last words were, "I am Jack," and then the platform opened, and the trapdoor went through, and then he was hanged without being able to finish the sentence. There are other variants of the story where he didn't actually say, "I am Jack," like meaning "I am Jack the Ripper," but his sentence was interrupted. He just said, "I am J." Just the first letter J was uttered. The first sound of the letter J was spoken. So he didn't even actually say that he was Jack the Ripper. But the statement from Martin Fido was that the executioner, the man who committed the execution, and performed the execution rather, of Thomas Neal Cream, went on to write a memoir, and he mentioned nothing about the story of Thomas Neal Cream. And once I heard that, I was like, okay, I've just done this episode on Thomas Neal Cream for Ripper Wednesday, which you guys can listen to here. Let's go see what this memoir is all about. And I started looking for it, and I found that the man who had committed the execution, or, excuse me, I shouldn't say committed, performed, the man who had performed the execution of Thomas Neal Cream was named James Billington. And he's the subject of the book Billington, Victorian Executioner, written by Alison Bruce. And I've talked to you guys about that book before, but I didn't see anything about Billington's memoir where he chose to omit the story of Thomas Neal Cream. Because I was reading about the Jack the Ripper suspect William Henry Bury, I found that the man who executed William Henry Bury was named James Barry. And, I mean, James Billington, James Barry, is it possible that someone made a mistake? Because James Barry went on to write a memoir called My Experiences as an Executioner. The alternative title of it is Hangman, and then the subtitle is My Experiences as an Executioner. And that is the book that completely omits anything involving this Jack the Ripper suspect. And I would really hope that somebody like Martin Fido wouldn't make this particular type of blunder or error in his commentary. In fact, I hope that I'm wrong about this, but that's what it seems. I mean, like you can see very clearly, there's the memoir that was written by James Barrie, not James Billington, talking about his experiences as an executioner, and he did indeed execute William Henry Bury. However, he didn't mention anything about the Jack the Ripper case or William Henry Bury being a Jack the Ripper suspect. Again, I hope that I have misunderstood that, just to give credit to Martin Fido, because as a ripperologist, he sounded so passionate when he was talking about his suspect, David Cohen, again also known as Nathan Kaminsky, and he just sounded like he knew what he was talking about. And, in terms of persuasion tactics, or just somebody genuinely believes what they're saying. But at the same time, I've also encountered this when interacting with other true crime researchers. Some people will have a very high understanding of a true crime case, yet they're still going to make mistakes from time to time. And I mean, they're just levels beyond me. I'm just some guy that watches stuff on YouTube and reads books and listens to podcasts. Of course I make mistakes, but people who have just spent decades, tens upon tens of years with this material, and then they still are going to make simple errors from time to time. So I think that there are some other points that we need to address with William Henry Bury as a Jack the Ripper suspect. And one of them is one piece of evidence that could connect him to the crime scene is the Goulston Street graffito. And that is that after the murder of Catherine Eddowes, a message was written in chalk on a building that said, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." After the murder of Ellen Bury, his wife, 2 messages were found around the building where they lived. And one of them said that Jack the Ripper had been in the cellar. Was that some type of confession? Well, again, if he had tried to confess that way, why wouldn't he just confess before he was being executed? He confessed to murdering his wife. He confessed to murder, but denied being Jack the Ripper. Well, what is he doing? Just playing some type of twisted mind game with people? I find that this is overall somewhat of an incomprehensible narrative, and that's what I will have to leave it for now. But if you have any responses about William Henry Bury as a Jack the Ripper suspect, I'd love to know. And I do have to share one final thing, because I found an article from thescotsman.com. The website is actually just referred to as Scotsman, but it talked about how William Henry Bury was indeed convicted and, as previously stated, executed, but they did a 21st century recreation of the trial, a mock trial, if you will, and people are arguing the case, and it was done as like a project. And ultimately, the mock jury found him not guilty. And at first I thought, well, this is reminding me so much of the story of Dr. Crippen and the article that I was discussing from The Guardian last week, which somebody in the comment section encouraged me to read, which stated that Dr. Crippen was someone else from the, he was an American doctor in England who could have possibly been wrongfully accused and wrongfully convicted and executed of the murder of his wife. And then this is just happening again with William Henry Bury, but with the Dr. Crippen case, they have DNA evidence, and with the William Henry Bury case, it just seems that the jury decided that he was not guilty, and this seems like it's a little bit more open to interpretation. But if anyone wants to read that, it's on thescotsman.com, talking about this mock trial. Now, I do want to say some final things about Dr. Crippen, because Dr. Hawley Crippen was accused of murdering his wife, and he had a mistress whom he took first to continental Europe, disguised her as a boy, and they're trying to play the role of father and son, and then they took a ship to America, but the ship's captain recognized him, or was suspicious of him, and he actually used the wireless telegraph to alert the authorities, and it became the first case that was primarily solved because of the wireless telegraph. And when I was reading that article from The Guardian last week talking about how they did a DNA test on the remains that were found in Dr. Crippen's house, again, he was accused of murdering his wife, and there was not a DNA match, meaning that it was a mitochondrial DNA test, and mitochondrial DNA can not prove someone's guilt, but it can rule somebody out. And there was no match at all, though. So that leaves me with 2 possibilities. Number 1, the DNA evidence was wrong, some way, somehow it was incorrect, or that it wasn't Cora Crippen, who was buried in the house, and it's in the cellar, and it's under some stones or brick-like area, but it was actually somewhat well conceived, and I wanted to find out more about this story, so I got on Amazon.com and I've pulled up a free sample of the memoir that was written by Walter Dew, the person who famously caught Dr. Crippen. His memoir is even called I Caught Crippen, and there is something very valuable in it for a free sample from Kindle, a free sample on Kindle, if you can believe that, and that is that there's an introductory essay that was written about Walter Dew stating that he wrote the memoir I Caught Crippen as possibly for financial gain, but also because it was the most famous case that he had solved. Walter Dew was an inspector in the Jack the Ripper case in his early years, but that case, of course, remains unsolved. And with the story of Dr. Crippen, he states very clearly, emphatically, 100% in the beginning of the book, these are the words of Walter Dew, that, oh, he did it. He was begging for his life, saying, I'm not guilty, one day science will clear my name. But he's like, no, absolutely, he did it. But some points in the book are that Walter Dew was not the first person to find the body of Cora Crippen in the cellar. It was actually the sergeant who was on duty at the time who noticed something that was odd in the flooring, and then Walter Dew was the first person to start poking at the stones. And it shows that he's writing this thing based on memory, so errors could again occur. And he made other errors throughout his career with law enforcement, and I don't even fault him too much for that, because if I had heard that 20 years ago, I'd be like, yep, he did it on purpose. He's just making errors. He's making the stuff up. He's pulling it out of his imagination. He's lying because he wants to sell a good book. But now that I'm in my mid-30s, actually, I'm 35 now, I forget things all the time. I mean, 20 years ago, things that you think you remember very clearly, but then it turns out that they didn't actually happen. And I think some of our older listeners to this program can comprehend that to a certain extent. But it goes on to show that Dr. Crippen begins to act very weird after the stories of his wife's disappearance, because firstly, even before her remains were discovered, Dr. Crippen is printing out mourning cards, and he's distributing to people, and he's telling them that his wife is dead. And then he gets confronted by the Inspector Walter Dew and says, all right, I've been telling people that my wife is dead, but that's not true. She's actually alive. And again, it's just like, what on earth is going on? Then they find the remains. And, I mean, I think the initial response that a lot of people would have was, he's trying to get his story straight. He's trying to work something out. And then also, it could be, based on some new findings, that he was telling the truth after all, and that I thought about this. And you can respond in the comment section that his wife actually had a different woman murdered and a different woman buried in the basement. I don't think she would have committed the crime herself, but either paying someone or instructing someone to do it so that he would be blamed for her murder. And not only was she poisoned, but her body was also mutilated once again. And I thought about that. Then she can just go off to America and live by herself, and that he'll be blamed for it, kind of like a revenge plot. But I have no proof of that. Pure speculation, pure imagination. But if anybody has any comments about the Dr. Crippen case, you can put your ideas in the comment section down below. And the final thing that I would like to do in this episode is to end with a poem, the way that I have with some of the previous Jack the Ripper reports. And the reason why was because I was talking a lot about the Jack the Ripper suspect, Francis Thompson, who was an accomplished poet, but I have to be very honest with you guys once again. Firstly, I used to think very highly of Francis Thompson as a Jack the Ripper suspect, but now he just kind of goes a little bit down on my list. And the reason is because I was listening to Richard Patterson talk about all the reasons, giving 2-hour presentations on all the reasons why he thinks that Francis Thompson was Jack the Ripper. He was a failed doctor, a failed priest, worked in a medical instrument factory as a quality control inspector. He had a failed relationship with a prostitute. This seemed like someone who had the brain for becoming Jack the Ripper. And not to mention some types of connection to poetry and intellectual craftsmanship, creativity in a destructive way. But over time, I really began to think about how maybe some of those things indicate that he does not necessarily match up. And one of them was, I was listening to an interview with Richard Patterson that I had not heard before, and he was talking about part of his theory that Francis Thompson could have been Jack the Ripper because he was murdering women whom he thought were prostitutes, even if they were not prostitutes to some people dispute that to this day, that they weren't actually sex workers. Other people say with certainty they were. But if he thought they were prostitutes, Francis Thompson was a deeply religious man, so he viewed them as sinners whom he could murder. And I was like, now wait a second. Deeply religious, committing murder? I mean, how do those things even tie in together? But I have to be honest. Whoever committed the Whitechapel murders was not thinking in any type of sane manner. Sometimes with insanity, there are going to be things that do not make sense to us. But that definitely pushed me the wrong way. And also, I began to think much more about Jacob Levy as a Jack the Ripper suspect. He was a butcher, lived in the area. He had neurosyphilis, which he most likely contracted from a prostitute, and that could have affected his impulses and decision-making. And I don't necessarily subscribe to Pat Brown's theory about how Jacob Levy would have committed 4 murders, but not the murder of Mary Kelly. Again, I just think that I need some time to truly evaluate that before I would ever sign on to a theory like that. But instead, I would like to begin with a poem from a different writer, and his name is Lewis Carroll, a Jack the Ripper suspect, whom I've talked about only briefly on these Jack the Ripper reports. And this is a poem from mypoeticside.com, that's where it is, but it's written by Lewis Carroll, called A Boat Beneath a Sunny Sky. A boat beneath a sunny sky, lingering onward dreamily, in an evening of July, children 3 that nestle near, eager eye and willing ear, pleased a simple tale to hear. Long has paled that sunny sky, echoes fade and memories die, autumn frosts have slain July, still she haunts me phantom-wise, Alice moving under skies, never seen by waking eyes, children yet the tale to hear, eager eye and willing ear, lovingly shall nestle near. In a wonderland they lie, dreaming as the days go by, dreaming as the summers die, ever drifting down the stream, lingering in the golden dream. Life, what is but a dream? Do you guys really think this guy was Jack the Ripper? Do you guys think this guy killed anyone? I think that this is someone who would probably rather get lost in a daydream about flowers and milk and just things that were big and puffy and gentle than go on to become Jack the Ripper. But that's just my take on the subject, and Lewis Carroll is a Jack the Ripper suspect, and people do have reasons for this and reasons why they suspect him. And I also have to give the concession that even though that poem was extremely childish and gentle and just talking about lighthearted things like a summer's day and the sky and the boat, well, sometimes serial killers have extremely childish behavior. I remember the priest that baptized Jeffrey Dahmer even said that after spending 5 minutes with him, like, his personality changed after 5 minutes, and he just became extremely childlike. And also it's observed that serial killers can develop some behavior that is a little bit bizarre, but also silly. For example, John Wayne Gacy dressing up as Pogo the Clown, and he had reasons for that. He didn't do that purely for his own entertainment. I mean, he would go out in public as Pogo the Clown, but it is something a little bit silly all the same. What do you think about any of these suspects as Jack the Ripper? I would love to know what you think about the explanation at the beginning about how Charles Lechmere might not have been Jack the Ripper because, well, someone else did it and they got away and they were not noticed. What do you think about that? What do you think about William Burry as a Jack the Ripper suspect and all of the things I've discussed in that one here? Do you think that Dr. Crippen was guilty? Or any of the suspects that I've mentioned at the end? Jacob Levy, Francis Thompson, and Lewis Carroll. I'd love to read your responses down below. Feel free to tune in to the live stream, follow along with the audiobook for Killer on a White Horse. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box. And you can go through some of the links, BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNed88. And I'll see you over on Instagram. Until next time.